friends, this is Lada and Oz is here. Hi, Oz.
Hi, everyone.
And we are doing a new Cayuga Lake talk. It is actually late November, and soon we will have snow and ice and all that, and we will not be able to do it outdoors. So we decided to do it one last time, maybe a couple of last times, because we love this area so much. We're currently in our marina, so that's Cayuga Lake, Ithaca, New York, upstate, and we have some very interesting topics to discuss with you. And the topic that we chose for this particular discussion, there are quite a few requests from my Patreon members who wanted to know more about the real story of the Nostradamus of the 20th century, Bulgarian prophetess Baba Varga. And so Baba Varga, who lived in Bulgaria throughout most of the 20th century, she left quite a few interesting predictions and prophecies. Many of you might know this, and certainly Lada Patreon members, you certainly know that I make my predictions. I create futures, trendcast, and theories that predict the future. I don't try to call myself a prophetess, but certain things that I predict, such as the Earth shift, the Great Earth shift and Russia the Great Balancer theories, these are prophecies. And many of you already noticed that they are coming true. Along the way, I also predicted quite a few events, global events, that the majority of which came true already or are coming true. And my track record speaks for itself. The vast majority, I would say, what percentage would you say of my predictions?
Oh, over 90%. Actually, 100%
Well,
for certain.
Not 100%. Yeah,
elections,
almost 100%. Well, let's just say 90-something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens here is that sometimes we do get bifurcated reality, micro shifts of reality, and what many people know as Mandela Effect is that you remember it one way and it actually happened a different way. All that meshes together because this is all part of the Great Earth shift, and then reality becomes changed and shifted in such a way that after the fact you're like, wait a minute, what just happened? How could that happen? I will discuss what bifurcated reality, micro shifts, what really Mandela Effect is, and how all this is related to the Great Earth shift. I will discuss that in a separate episode, and I will give you examples, guys. I will give you definitions, and we'll focus specifically on that. It will not be geopolitically or politically oriented talk, but I might give you some examples that are politically oriented because it is through politics, through geopolitics, through various social movements and ideology is when how humanity oftentimes realizes the biggest shifts in its reality. Okay, because this depends on the will of individuals, of leaders, and the masses, as well as the struggle between the yin and yang, the two sides of our existence, which is another topic we should discuss on a different occasion. So as you see, we're currently on our marina, which is stark empty because all the boats are gone. You may see some seagulls once in a while. We just met some really nice ducks, but that's about it. But it's okay if it's a little gloomy. As you see, we don't have sun, unfortunately, today, and all the leaves are gone. But the topic of the discussion is very, very interesting, and it sort of encompasses the entire 20th century and leaps into the 21st century. I also want to mention, guys, that I'm doing a new series of webinars. To see all of my webinars, many of which are predictive webinars and trendcasting webinars, as well as they combine the past, present, and future beyond the obvious, which is one of my slogans, one of my taglines, and creating the Earth shift is another tagline of mine. And go to ladaray.com and you can click on webinars on top. It's the tag on top, or scroll down the homepage to find the webinars that are listed on the homepage. We also will have other events, and I'm preparing a new subscription for the year 2021. I'm preparing workshops, which will be ongoing events in 2021, 22, and afterwards. That will be one of my new trademarks. I want to pre-announce that. And don't forget that I'm planning a new series of webinars. These are going to be Lada Predictions webinars for the future of the US, the future of the Europe and the EU, and the future of China. Please visit ladare.com, or if you are a member of patreon.com/ladare, that's Ladare Patreon, and Future Strandcast, you will also find announcements on my Future Strandcast blog or on Ladare Patreon. Without further ado, let's proceed to Baba Varga. You probably know other names of famous prophets and prophetesses, such as Nostradamus, very well known in the West. And it's like pretty much, if you want to call somebody a prophet, you call them, oh, it's a Nostradamus of such and such. So Baba Varga, called by some the prophetess or Nostradamus of the 20th century. Of course, you know Edgar Cayce. He doesn't need an introduction. And some of you may know the Ringing Cedars series, those who are interested in spirituality and in prophecies about Russia and Russia's future role, which is a big part of my work, by the way. And that would be Anastasia. In Russian, correct, it's to say Anastasia. That's how we say that name, Anastasia. But in English, it's pronounced as Anastasia. So prophetess Anastasia of Siberia and the Ringing Cedars series, which if you did not read that, then is highly recommended. I talk a lot about that series in my book, Geopolitical Quantum Calibrations, which you can get on Amazon. And you can get it on Apple for ebook. You can get it on Barnes and Noble's website, and I believe in quite a few other places that sell ebooks and other distributors globally, worldwide distributors, such as Book Depository, etc. So you can find all this. I also talk about Anastasia, about Edgar Cayce in my other works, in my webinars, and we'll be talking more about that in workshops. And if you guys like this series, we will also do some other stuff. Like, for example, we can do a talk on Anastasia. Well, Oz actually here, he is very well versed in Anastasia and her predictions and the Ringing Cedars and Siberia and all of those naturopathic things. So I will include him in the future talk. Now, let's proceed to Baba Varga. And I want to tell you that her life oftentimes reads like the Wizard of Oz, with all the goods and bads of the Wizard of Oz. So the way it started, it was the beginning of the 20th century. And if I'm not mistaken, that was in the midst of World War I. The World War I raged, and she was a young girl at the time, and she grew up in a remote Bulgarian village, and once there was a tornado, honest to goodness tornado, that picked her up when she was in her own yard, on her own property, picked her up and carried her away in a huge cloud of mud and dust. And then she was deposited like far away and buried in that mud and dust. And the people from the village were looking for her, and they finally found her. And that was like 1 or 2 days after they dug her out of that dust, and she was alive. But her eyes were covered with all that mud, with all that dirt. And she, as a young girl, she was unable to keep her eyes closed, or it was too late. And so all that dust made her blind. She was not born blind. She, in fact, was born with normal vision, and she was a pretty much normal village girl until that happened to her. So she lived the rest of her life with her eyes closed. Basically, you can see on the picture how her eyes are fully closed, her eyelids are closed, because she was trying to protect herself from the dust. So she went blind physically. However, that opened up her psychic vision. And after that, she became a local celebrity. It was still a very remote village, uneducated peasants. And so people would come to her and ask her, for example, my goat ran away, and she would pinpoint where the goat is, and people would find it. Or because it was those kinds of days, it was World War I, and people would come to her in tears, like, can you tell me if my beloved fiancé or my husband or my brother or my son are alive somewhere at war? And she would also give them some comfort and solace and tell them what is happening, what she's seeing. And these things continued, and she became very famous eventually. And then many things happened throughout the 20th century. Her main fame falls on the times of when Bulgaria became part of the socialist camp. It was part of the Warsaw Pact and part of the Russian sphere of influence, of course very close to Russian sphere of influence, because Bulgaria is very close both spiritually, religiously, language-wise, mentality-wise to Russia, even though it's separated by, it doesn't have a border right now with Russia, had one with the Soviet Union previously. And so she was very popular with Russians, and really, truly, because Bulgaria is a small country. Just look at the map, you'll see where Bulgaria is located on the Black Sea. Just because the influence of Bulgaria is small, she was locally famous. The government of Bulgaria gave her a nice, solid house to live in, and some people to wait on her, like a maid and helpers, people who helped her around the house and around the property, because she was blind. She needed, and she was also getting on with age. She became a national treasure of Bulgaria, but without Russian influence and without Russians promoting her, she would not have had this much fame. So some people, both people who were ordinary people from Russia and famous people from Russia, would come to consult her about different topics, or would just come to see her to see if she might impart some wisdom. And this is how she became famous, and this is how her predictions and her prophecies became known to the world. As, of course, Soviet Union was a giant superpower, and even though it didn't have the MSM of the West that could trumpet her, about her and her accomplishments throughout the world, but Soviet Union still had quite a bit of pull, and she was mainly famous throughout Eastern Europe and the USSR. And so people would come to her, and there are some stories told. So she lived in this house. The government would charge money. And as I said, that was socialism. So that was actually very common. She would be considered a government employee. And because she was already getting on with age, and she was also blind, she actually, seriously handicapped, in fact, she was very active nevertheless, but she did need help. So she had helpers in the house. She had people who would write down certain things, those who cleaned for her, who helped her around, but she was still cooking. And what was interesting, she was known for her needlework. So her needlework was displayed in the house. It would be like crochet, table placements or runners or and stuff. That's one of the arts that are pretty common, were pretty common in 19th, 20th centuries, probably before that, in Eastern Europe, in the Slavic countries. And I remember my family also had some of those cute needlework crochet pieces that you lay on the table or something. And my mother taught me how to do that. So so Baba Varga, despite being blind, she was pretty good at that, because she was taught to do that by her mother, apparently, when she was still a young girl, when she could still see. And so she liked to do that. I understand she liked to cook somewhat. And when people came to see her, so she would see them in the house, and that house was given to her by the government. The government would charge money, not even that much money, for people to see her for appointments. And then instead of, basically, she was given everything in exchange for her fame, for her being a Bulgarian brand name. And the government sort of a little bit controlled that, but I don't think it could be that much controlled, because she, in fact, uttered whatever she saw with her inner eye. So being blind opened up that ability to see multidimensionally, what I call multidimensionally. She could see in different dimensions, past, present, and future. She could predict certain things very accurately, some not so accurately. And as I said, her track record is considered pretty high, higher than Nostradamus, for example. And that would be about 70-something%, right, Az? What was the percentage that you heard of?
76%, and it was much more
Speak up, please.
much more definitive than Nostradamus, because Nostradamus, his predictions were kind of like in these triomes where it's very difficult to decipher because he tried to encode it, and but Baba Vanga's predictions were very straightforward and accurate.
Straightforward, and they were also closer in time. But although the time frame of Nostradamus is argumentative for what periods he really was predicting. It's possible he was predicting for his immediate present and future, but people trying to interpret it as if something happened a lot later. And the reason quatrains and all that was used is because those times were difficult. He had to hide his real intention, his real predictions oftentimes, so that not to be executed by some willful king who didn't like what he said. That is possible, actually. And you know, I fully understand that. I oftentimes have to speak only to those students of mine, acolytes of mine, or people who are followers, who are true followers, who will understand what I'm saying, so that something is not misinterpreted. So people who, like, you know, casual people who stumble and have no idea, or some dark forces would not mess with my energy, my predictions, etc., etc. So to this day, this is still true. So I fully get that. We'll discuss my predictions and microshifts and dark forces and demonics, etc., in other episodes, I hope, pretty soon. So stay tuned to this. To the Cayuga Lake talks, to my journal talks, and especially if you don't want to miss anything, then subscribe to patreon.com/Lada. This is where you get everything. So back to Baba Varga. There are some interesting episodes on prophecies and predictions that she has made. One of them was, I will just tell you one episode. You probably all know the first cosmonaut, first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. So Yuri Gagarin died during a test flight several years after his maiden voyage to space. His maiden voyage to space was April 12th, 1961, for those who are not familiar with cosmonautics and what went on in those days and how the first flights to space happened. Of course, the first man in space, first woman in space, first walk in space, free walk in space, first Sputnik, first apparatus in space, all that were Russian or Soviet in those days, which in fact means Russian. So Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space. He died several years later, if I'm not mistaken, in 1966, and it was blamed on a test flight. Some people had conspiracy theories about that. And one of his big friends was a Russian movie star, Vyacheslav Tikhonov. Those who grew up like me in Russia, they know this name very well. So Vyacheslav Tikhonov came to see Baba Varga like 1 year after perhaps Gagarin died. And they were close friends. And so he walks into the door. He later wrote about it and said that he was shocked by how Baba Varga, in fact, met him. So he walks through the door, and she says to him point blank right away, and remember, she's blind, right? She probably knew it was Vyacheslav Tikhonov, but she's blind. And so she says, hey, she says, so what happened to the watch that Yuri gave you? And Tikhonov says, I froze, because shortly before he died, and there was a treasured possession of Tikhonov's at the time, Yuri Gagarin presented him with a watch, with a special watch as a token of his friendship and appreciation. And there were some words attached to that watch that, remember me by this watch, etc., etc. So Tikhonov said, I froze, and this whole grief flooded into him. And Baba Varga says, I know one of the reasons you came to see me is to remind you of your past friend Yuri Gagarin. But do you know that he was taken? And that's all she said about Gagarin, and she refused to elaborate. And Tikhonov was so overcome with emotion and tears and everything that he could not even ask her any more questions. Basically, he was taken. That's how she said it. Well, people asked me afterwards, what does this mean exactly? He was taken, and there are various ways of doing taking somebody out of reality. There is a phrase that the most precious people, I'm paraphrasing, God wants the most precious, the best people close to him because he can't bear to have those best people away from him. So that's why one interpretation. Another one, he's taken out of reality for whatever reason. Well, if anybody has questions about how these things happen, we can discuss it differently. But I do not think that there was a negative connotation here, that he was taken in a positive way. In other words, he ascended. That's how I interpret what she was in fact saying. Because Gagarin was already born in pretty high dimension. He was a 6D soul to begin with when he incarnated. And I believe that that was a major promotion at that point. He accomplished everything there was to accomplish. He brought humanity into the beginnings of the lower 4D era, to beginnings of the space exploration, kind of opening human eyes to the fact that there's more than we can touch and see, and the fact that there is more in our world that is immediately on Earth. And that was his mission here, and then he could proceed to the new mission, basically, which was away from this planet in higher dimensions, in fact. So that's the story of how she talks about Gagarin. Then there was another very famous, or should we say infamous, prophecy that came true, or prediction, let's say. She said, and that was sometime in 1970s or 80s maybe, I'm not sure exactly when, I believe it was in 1970s, and nobody could understand what she meant until much later. She said, in the year 1999 or the year 2000, Kursk will be underwater, or will go deep underwater, will drown underwater. And everybody, what? The city of Kursk, that's a Russian city, like heartland Russia, is in fact nowhere near big water. You can actually look at the map, and Kursk, it's spelled as Kursk. It is actually in the Russian flatlands, what is called Russian flatlands or heartlands. And that city would be underwater. How is that even possible? That's way inland. There are many places that are much closer to water, say Odessa, St. Petersburg, Odessa on the Black Sea, St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea, and many, many other places like Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea, etc., that could be underwater. Crimea, for that matter, on the Black Sea, right? Sochi, so many places. And so people were shocked and could not understand, and thought that she made a mistake or misspoke, and it could never happen. And it was that prediction was sitting and doing nothing until it was, I believe, the year 1999. Yes, it was 1999, exactly that. The submarine, a Russian submarine called Kursk, went underwater. And those of you who followed the events and who are old enough to remember, they remember how big of a tragedy that was. In fact, it was such a tragedy that the whole country was grieving. It was in the 90s. It was the end of the 90s, the era which was the worst since World War II for Russia. It was about 8 years after the breakup of the USSR. It was the what was called the crazy 90s, the terrible 90s. There are many epithets and adjectives that are assigned to that era when a lot of people got impoverished, and when the Russian army separated from its brethren like Ukrainians, who, army was simply torn apart, and nobody was financing it, nobody was taking care of the equipment, and the submarine, atomic submarine Kursk, apparently had a problem of some sort, and it actually drowned. It went underwater, very, very deep underwater in the Baltic Sea. Russians tried to lift it up because the whole crew was there, over 100 people. And everybody died. They tried and they finally lifted it up, but they were unable to save anybody's lives. Everybody died there. They didn't have enough oxygen at that point. As a matter of fact, foreign countries also tried to get involved in that and offered Russia help, but because it was Pentagon we're talking NATO, Russians could not accept that kind of help because it was actually state-of-the-art submarine, one of the latest built by the Soviet Union, with a lot of secrets on board. And when it was lifted, the tragedy was humongous, was astronomical tragedy. Nobody can believe it because it never happened in the entire history of Russia and the Soviet Union that a Russian equipment, Russian submarine would drown and nobody would be able to save people like that. And for no reason, apparently, there was some kind of technical malfunction. The tragedy was humongous. So everybody remembered suddenly that that was the prophecy made by Baba Varga many years prior. And everybody was in shock. Additionally, because of that prophecy coming true in such strange way. Nobody expected that, actually. So another thing that happened, why this prophecy is so remembered also, not only because it was such a major tragedy that actually came true in the weirdest and bizarrest of ways, also because, Putin at the time was rising to power, and he took full responsibility. He went and he grieved together with all those widows who never got their husbands back, and mothers whose children died there. And he made a promise to himself, a solemn promise, to rebuild the Russian army. Now, 20 years later, guys, if you follow my writings, what I say on patreon.com/Lada, and I talk about it all the time, you see what kind of victories the Russian army has. I wrote on Future Strengthcast about that previously on many occasions. Russian weapons are superior by far. Russian army is superior by far. It is smaller army. It is fewer, less tech, less hardware than the U.S. army by far, by several times, and even than the Chinese army has. And of course, many more soldiers the Chinese army has and the U.S. army has, fewer bases, but nobody would ever touch the Russian army. The weapons are hypersonic. Weapons are beyond any nuclear weapons. They're so much better in so many ways. And literally, the projections of any other army in the world would be that they could not come anywhere near the Russian army, because it's like 1-2 days, and any army except for American army or Chinese army, because they're so numerous and also advanced, but even those don't stand a chance because of the weapons that are shown. You remember my Earthshift report 4, in which I showed you some of the electronic weapons that Russia has. Then I did in the beginning of 2020, I believe, I did also a report in which I showed you the newest Russian weapons, which very few people believed at the time, but then there were confirmations that what those weapons can do. And Russia is literally decades ahead of everybody else. In other words, from that tragedy, from that huge sacrifice of human life of that submarine Kursk, Russians rose again, and Putin made sure and made that promise that the Russian army will again be respected, being in the military will be respected, that he will restore salaries and good conditions for service, for life to the families, which did not exist in the 90s when everybody forsaked the army and then everybody forgot about it. And we can see with Shoigu being the Minister of Defense and the Russian general chiefs of staff, etc., how well they work. The Syrian successes, the Crimean successes, now the new predictions that came true of mine, how Russia without a single shot fired, how Russia increased the influence in the Caucasus and Russian peacekeepers. Now in Nagorno-Karabakh, and the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan has been successfully ended by Russia, and many other things. There is another secret success, the new naval base in Sudan, which is a major success because that controls the Suez Canal. And I don't have to tell you what Suez Canal means for the world trade and the oil trade. It's literally everything. It's the artery where most of the oil and trade goes through. So basically that one prediction, that one prophecy, in fact, was very pivotal. This is why it is so famous. But then she made another prophecy, apparently also in the 70s, when nobody had a frame of reference for this. And she said something like this. It's pretty close to what she said, that everything will turn to dust. Everything will end or go away. And only the glory of Russia and the glory of Vladimir will stay or persist or will shine. And she indicated that would be in the 21st century. And at the time, whether it was 1970s or 80s, nobody had any frame of reference for what it was about. Most likely it was done in 1970s because, guys, you can check it online, but I don't remember the exact date of Baba Varga's passing. It must have been in 1980s sometime. So she said that. It was like, huh? Everybody said, again, what will turn to dust? What will change so much in the world? And guys, look, this really goes hand in hand with my great Earthshift predictions, guys, okay? Or prophecies, if you want to call them that, right? And Russia, the Great Balancer prophecies. In all my predictions and prophecies about the role of Vladimir Putin. At the time, there was no Vladimir anywhere inside, and everybody started guessing. In the past, there were only two famous Vladimirs in Russian history. One was Vladimir Monomach, who was one of the famous warriors, knyaz, which means ruler. It's like the king, same as king, not prince, but king. A lot of people mistranslated, very incorrect translation, calling it prince. It is the equivalent of a king or ruler. You don't translate sultan, right? Sultan. Or czar, for that matter. So this is like an equivalent of czar. Czars were later. So that's a medieval history. Vladimir Monomach. And he united a lot of Russian lands. And his capital at the time was the city of Vladimir, which is part of the gold ring around Moscow currently. And then there was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. So two in the past. And a lot of people were scratching their heads. Is this the glory of Vladimir Lenin, or is it the Vladimir Monomach, which is like very ancient history? But since she was talking about the 21st century and the future, everybody was confused about that. And now we know who Vladimir is. That's Vladimir Putin, in fact. And these are the stories of Baba Varga and the legacy she left. When Vladimir Putin came to power, at first, nobody thought he was in any way important or interesting. And only several years later, when he started consolidating power, building the power vertical, as it was called in Russia, rebuilding the army, booting out oligarchs or keeping them on a leash in some sort of like framework of you're either patriotic and help me out to rebuild Russia, or you're out of here. When he was starting to prosecute various corrupt people, money launderers, all kinds of traitors, when he rebuilt everything, all the power structures in Russia, including police, including actually Medvedev also has a role in rebuilding the police, even though he is often maligned. And he helped Putin a lot, which most people don't recognize. And the reason they don't recognize it is because of Medvedev's karma. And I talk about it a lot in my very well received, my famous webinar called the Putin Enigma. I discuss both Putin and Medvedev, and I talk about Lavrov there and the other people at the helm in Russia, and I calibrate them, and I tell you about reincarnation there. For example, reincarnation of Medvedev, on what he was and who he was. I talk about the monk, the infamous monk Grigory Rasputin, and his role, and how Putin and Rasputin, whether there is a connection between the two, and in what way, and how they diverge in their energy. And I tell you everything about Putin. There is a little bit about Lenin there, and lots of different calibrations. But this webinar is found on ladaray.com. Again, go under programs and webinars, or on the homepage you will also find my webinars and a link to them. So please, that's the webinar. If you want to know about Putin, about Russia, about the past, present, and future of Russia, my predictions, my calibrations for everything, what is Russia the Great Balancer, etc., etc., and my interpretation, which is a higher dimensional interpretation of what happened, then you actually need the Putin Enigma webinar, which is Earthshift webinar 6. Well, the thing is that Putin created a new Russia, created a new paradigm in Russia and the world. And he's the leader that is necessary during this time of the Great Earth Shift, and to lead Russia, the Great Balancer, into this new time, to rebalance the world. And a great Earth Shift and great rebalancing like this, of this magnitude, happens only every 1,000 years, or even every 2,000 years. And we are entering, this is the Aquarian age, and we are also entering, we already entered, in fact, the galactic dawn. And I'm going to tell you more about these things in my future workshops coming in 2021 and 22 to you. And in addition to that, I am also going to tell you some of these things in some of my free videos, which I will post on YouTube and Future Strandcast, and of course on patreon.com/ladaray. So stay tuned for that. And this is all for this talk. And I hope you enjoyed it. Give me a big thumbs up. Till next time, wishing you all the best. Blessings from Ladaray and ladaray.com. Peace. Talk to you soon.